Hello, this is Group 1's presentation. We will be covering the foreword as well as Chapter 1 of this lovely textbook. Ethics, the Heart of Leadership. It is written by Joanne Ciulla, and the foreword is by James MacGregor Burns. I will be covering the foreword. My name is Melissa Heath. And after that, you will hear from the other members of Group 1, Zachary Yost, Aaron Kleiman, and Breland McCauley. The book is broken down into different sections. Section 1 is the scope of the issue. It contains chapters 1 and 2. Our group, again, is covering Chapter 1, which is expanding the territory. So the foreword, again written by James MacGregor Burns, discusses 3 different types of leadership values. It is important to distinguish between these 3 different leadership values, as a lot of times people seem to lump them all together as one idea. And again, it's important to discern between the 3 because they are different, and it will affect the way in which we view leadership styles as we move and navigate throughout the course. So we have ethical virtues, ethical values, and moral values. Ethical virtues are the old-fashioned character tests, such as sobriety, chastity, kindness, altruism. These are the rules of personal conduct, or how one chooses to conduct themselves. Ethical values, on the other hand, are qualities such as honesty, integrity, trustworthiness, reliability, reciprocity, accountability, the qualities that one might ascribe to themselves or to others. Moral values, lastly, are qualities, characteristics such as order and security, liberty, equality, justice, community. We might consider these to be basic human rights that should be extended to all. Burns states that each of these types of leadership values has implications for styles and strategies of leadership itself. So what does that mean? Essentially, you have a variety of leadership styles, which we all know that, but different leadership styles may take on different leadership values. So, for example, you have the status quo leader. This may be the manager of an organization, some relatively stable society. They're going to be dependent on ethical virtues, such as kindness and altruism. You want everyone to play nice, get along. Everyone needs to do their part. So again, status quo leaders are going to rely more on ethical virtues. Transactional leadership, those that are in roles such as teachers or members of politics, they're going to rely more on ethical values. Honesty, integrity, trustworthiness, these are all characteristics that you want in a teacher or a member of politics. The transformative leader, you will see, will rely more on moral values, equality, enhancement of individual leadership, liberty, You think of Martin Luther King Jr., he was a transformative leader, and these are some of the topics in which his vision was based upon. Unfortunately, it is essentially impossible for any of all of these qualities and values to exist equally under one particular style of leadership. The more you see of one of these values, the less you're going to see of the other 2. So for example, ethical values tend to be culturally based. So in one particular culture, their value system may be completely different than the others. I thought of the question of honesty versus loyalty as an example. Would you lie for a friend to keep them out of trouble. In one particular culture, they may say yes, that loyalty supersedes honesty. They're going to lie for that friend out of loyalty. But in another culture, you may find that that is against, their moral code, or in reality, their ethical value. That being honest is more important than that loyalty. And so that's an example where you can see that ethical values are going to be different depending on the culture. The question that the book provides is the act of manipulation. So manipulation, most of us regard as being a bad thing. But is it not what all leaders, in essence, are kind of doing? Manipulation is influencing people's decision-making process, and a leader is going to essentially do that. I think the difference in what makes a good leader versus a bad leader in what they're doing with manipulation is it coercion, or is it for the good of the whole? And the book does discuss that in the foreword when the famous question is asked, is Hitler a leader? And a lot of people would say yes, simply because he had followers. But Burns is going to argue and say no, a leader is founded in ethics, and you cannot be considered a leader if your followers are coerced into following. So, going back to the 3 values, Burns kind of breaks down a few suggestions in regards to each of them. So, ethical values, as stated before, is going to vary vastly from culture to culture. Whereas ethical virtues, again, this is the rules of personal conduct, we're seeing that it's becoming more global in terms of what we view to be the ethical virtues. As we have a global market and privatization, we all are essentially trying to operate under the same code of honor. And lastly, we have moral values, which also Burns is going to state that from a global context, we're all getting on the same page as well for that. Despite the various ideologies that you see all around the world, there is definitely a movement towards liberty, equality, and community on a global context. This is, again, in my opinion, basic human rights, something that everyone should have equally. And so we are seeing a shift globally towards that. Are we there? Probably not. But we're seeing that happening more and more. So, what is the relationship of these 3 values and the vision? To be a leader is to have a vision, and so you have to be able to incorporate the virtues, the values, morality, all of these things in order to have a proper vision. In one of the first videos that we saw from Professor, he stated, ethics leads to trust, trust leads to leadership. And so with that, we have to be able to take these 3 individual components, ethical virtues, ethical values, and moral values, and form a vision that makes sense in order for us to be effective leaders.
Hi, I'm Zach Yos, and I'm in Group 1. Today I'm going to go over leadership ethics, expanding the territory, and ethics without efforts. Ethics and leadership studies. These are 2 topics discussed in the Chapter 1. In the first section, we discuss how, as a society, we always seem to find issues with our leaders and their morals. As years have gone by, we have the ability to learn more and more about our leaders, but that only seems to bring up more issues. We have always learned that ethics play a huge role in being a leader, but that is not always portrayed in our leaders today. In the first section of Chapter 1, the author discusses this map used to guide the ideals of leadership, ethics, and being at the center of it all. In the second section, Ethics Without Effort, Ethics in Leadership Studies, the idea of ethics is discussed as common knowledge. Most people think they understand and have experienced ethics, but that's not necessarily true. The author goes on to say that ethics is something that can be learned. That is why there has been so many studies and research about it.
Hi, my name is Aaron Kleiman. I'm going over the second section of Chapter 1. This is going to start on page 8, Leadership and the Rosetta Stone. So most of Chapter 1 is introducing you to several different researchers and their ideas on leadership. So most leadership studies so far have been done through the perspective of management and in industrial psychology. Joe Rost, one of the main researchers, one of several main researchers, calls the industrial paradigm, which basically looks at leadership as being good management. Rost is mostly looking at leadership from a production standpoint, and he's not really focusing on things that make someone a leader, the traits, the ability to guide a group effectively. He's only looking at it from a position of authority, basically, more like management. Then we have Marta Calais and Linda Smirich, who try to explain why there's been very little research on ethics in the field of leadership. What they claim is that society puts a lot more value on science, and therefore the scientists try to dissect the concept of leadership into smaller parts. The problem with that with leadership is that leadership doesn't just come from the small parts. Everything comes together to make leadership. You could have 3 different parts, and if they're not there together, you're not going to have leadership. There's many different factors. They refer to this as trying to unlock the Rosetta Stone. They explain that the issue with leadership must be looked at from a social science and a philosophic view, and that not doing so doesn't gain any ground. So if scientists don't look at both the science and philosophy together, it's impossible to understand leadership, which makes sense because science is always cut and dry. Once you have a scientific fact, it's proven and you can't argue with it, whereas philosophy is left up to your interpretation. So those are two things that they don't mix well together, a cut and dry fact and something that's left to your interpretation. So you can see where there wouldn't be a lot of research because it's tricky ground to cover. Next 2 people we have are John Gardner and James MacGregor Burns. They're both big names in leadership studies, and they both believe also in the multidisciplinary approach to leadership. Gardner's not only he doesn't only study leadership, but he's held many roles of leadership in business, government, and a professor. He wrote a book on leadership, which I'm sure we'll discuss later in the book, where it discusses the ethics using the phrase, the moral dimension of leadership, which the important part of this is using that term, the dimension, just looking at it through that side, instead of taking that and saying that ethics is a part of it. You're just looking at that side of the one whole big thing, instead of breaking it down into the small parts that make it up. Burns also focuses on leadership as a whole. He relies more on historical leaders to make his points. Okay, so our next section is the paradigm, the shifting paradigm, or the shifty paradigm. What a paradigm is basically it's the model. It's what you would look at to, it's the framework of what something is. You dissect it, you look at it, this is basically what we see. So in order to study leadership ethics, you must study the leaders, the followers, and the leadership that transpires between them. This is from Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So some scholars believe the paradigm of leadership has been defined by social science research in management. Others have a completely different view, which I'm not covering that section, so we'll get there. So there seems to be a lack of extensive research on leadership because there's a need to reconcile scientific research with the philosophic aspect of leadership. Like I was saying before, You have cut and dried facts that have been proven in science, and then you have something that's left to interpretation, your philosophic aspect. It's kind of hard to put the two together, so not a lot has been done there. So it seems that scholars can't agree on on an actual model of how leadership works. They also can't agree on the definition of leadership. So we'll go down to page 12, locating the ethics. What do the definitions really tell us? So since Joseph Rost has analyzed 221 definitions of leadership in his book, just to show that there is no common definition of leadership. If you ask everyone in our class their definition of leadership, everyone has a different answer. Just to list off a few, he actually went through and picked a few from each period, a few definitions. One of them is 1920s. Leadership is the ability to impress the will of the leader on those led. So that's a pretty dictatorish definition. The 50s, leadership is what leaders do in groups. That's pretty vague. 1960s, leadership is acts by a person which influence other persons in a shared direction. And his own, Joseph Rost's own definition is from the 1990s. Leadership is an influence relationship between leaders and followers. I'm not reading these word for word. I'm sure you have your book. You can read through all of them. So the basic thing that all of these definitions have in common is they all talk about leadership as some type of process of an act or an influence over other people. Where they differ is how the leader gets people to do the things that they want. Do they impress them? Do they organize? Do they persuade, influence? Do they inspire people to do these acts? Or do they force them through authoritarian or dictatorship? That's where all these different definitions differ. All of these definitions differ a lot. They make it real clear that Rost doesn't like the theories from the 20s, the 70s, and the 80s because they are a lot more authoritarian. And he prefers the 40s, 50s, and 60s, plus his definition, of course, from the 90s, which are a lot more non-coercive. They're a lot more democratic. People are being influenced instead of forced into the ideas that the leadership has. They say rather than being induced into the actions, the leader's influence, kind of convincing you that that's what you want to do. Ross said that the leadership process is ethical if the people in the relationship freely agree that the intended changes fairly reflect their mutual purposes. That's pretty democratic definition there. So we'll move down. Philosopher Eva Kort, she said there's two different types of leaders. There's the proper leader and the purported leader. A proper leader is a leader where people freely choose to follow. And a purported leader is someone who you have to follow because of their position, like your boss, your manager. They're only a leader because of their position. Further down, Warren Bennis and Bernd Nanus kind of clarify differences between leadership and managers. They're two different things that are intertwined. Not intertwined, but definitions are changed back and forth a lot. While they mean different things, people confuse them a lot. They say the manager does things right and the leader does the right thing. So if you can dissect that and think about it for a second. They go on to say that leadership is overused. The word leadership is overused a lot of times to substitute for the word management, which are two different things. So further down on page 16, the third paragraph down, what we have, the ultimate question in leadership studies is not what is the definition of leadership, but what is good leadership. The word good you have to look at in two different ways, since we're in a leadership ethics class. There is good as in what's morally good, and good as in technically good. Are you morally a good leader, or are you just good at getting people to do what you want done? So we'll move down to the ethics and the effectiveness, the next section. Basically, going from that introduction there, are leaders more effective when they're nice to people, or are leaders more effective when they use certain techniques for structuring and ordering tasks? That's page 17, the second paragraph. That's pretty much sums up the idea of effectiveness versus ethicalness, versus ethics. Further down, the point is that no matter how much empirical information we get from the scientific study of leadership, it will always be inadequate if we neglect the moral implications. Basically, no matter how good of a leader you are you still a good leader if you're leading people toward bad things? The famous question, is Adolf Hitler a good leader? So the very last paragraph we have on page 17, what is the relationship between ethics and effectiveness? That's a good question there. Are you a good leader? Are you being ethical in what you're doing, or are you just being effective? Are you doing the right thing, or are you just doing what you're doing right and getting the results, whether they're good or bad? So good leaders can do bad things, and bad leaders can do good things. This is page 18. I can't fully pronounce the word. I believe it's Ariate that sums this up. It's an ancient Greek word. And since I feel it's probably important, I wrote it down, so here we are. I believe it's Ariate. And basically what it says, it's the idea of a virtue as an excellence that encompasses moral excellence and technical excellence, which is basically your effectiveness and being ethical, doing the right thing and doing it right. You have to have both in order to be a good leader. So that gets rid of the question of, was Adolf Hitler a good leader? Yeah, technically he got what he wanted done, but what he did wasn't right. So that completely clears that up. You have to have both. You have to have done it right, and it has to have been right, what you were leading people towards, in order to be a good leader. So further down on the page, I'll wrap it up. Researchers and ordinary people often talk about what leaders are, when what they really mean is what leaders should be. And this is pretty much how I see when someone asks me about leadership, I don't picture a person. I picture what I wish our leaders would be, what I wish our president was, no matter who's in office right now. What you wish your leader was, your boss, anyone. Not who they actually are, but the values that you would really like to see. So basically, going to wrap up on the end of page 18. The last paragraph, scholars don't really need to have one definition of leadership in order to understand each other. All they need are the ability to be clear about the values and the assumptions of what leadership is. That does it for my section. Thanks a lot.
There are two normative leadership theories in leadership, and those two are transformational and transactional leadership. A philosopher we looked at in the book is James MacGregor Burns. His theory of leadership is compelling because it rests on a set of moral assumptions between the leader and its followers. Burns uses the terms transforming and transformational in his book to describe this theory. Burns' transformational theory is a clear perspective of what values constitute morally good leadership. A big argument is that leaders need to operate at higher value levels than that of their followers. A leader's role is to exploit tension and conflict within people's value systems and play the role of raising people's consciousness. Transforming leaders have very high values, and that is why they use this to get their followers to listen to them. There has always been arguments about why ethics and morality have to be in leadership. Some think that just because some people think something is ethical, it does not always mean that it is, and vice versa. All of Burns' arguments and ideas of the moral question he brings up come from his history of being a biographer and a historian. Two pressing matters shape this leadership theory. The first one is the morality of means and ends, and the second one is the tensions between the public and private morality of a leader. The second theory Burns talks about is transactional leadership. This leadership rests on the values found in the means of an act. These are things called modal values. Modal values consist of responsibility, fairness, honesty, and promise keeping, which are all very important when it comes to being a leader. Transactional leadership helps the leader and followers reach their own goals by supplying lower level wants and needs so that they can move up to higher needs. Transforming leadership is concerned within values such as liberty, justice, equality, and transforming leaders raise their followers up through various stages of morality and turn their followers into leaders. Ideally, transforming leadership initials the withering away of the leader. If the leader has insufficient attention to means, can corrupt the ends. For example, Burns' answer to Hitler's question are that he was quite simply a leader that gained power and crushed all opposition, which made him no longer a leader. He was a tyrant. Burns offers three criteria for judging how Hitler would fare before the bar of history. First, he would be tested by modal values of honor and integrity, or the extent to which he advanced or thwarted the standard of good conduct in mankind. Second, he would be judged by the end values of equality and justice. Lastly, he would be judged on the impact that he had of the well-being of the people he touched. And according to Burns, Hitler failed all three of these tests. Burns doesn't consider Hitler a leader or a transforming leader because of the means that he used, the ends that he achieved, and the impact of Hitler as a moral agent on his followers. By looking at leadership as a process and not a set of individual acts, Burns' theory of good leadership is difficult to sum up into one ethical theory and calls for closer analysis. Leaders elevate their followers and make them leaders. Burns is also clear that followers can also influence and improve the morality of leaders. Transforming leadership aims at empowering followers and making them independent of their leaders. The second example of normative theory of leadership is servant leadership. And in Robert K. Greenleaf's book, Servant Leadership, A Journey into the Nature of Legitimate Power and Greatness, presents a view of how leaders ought to be. The idea of a servant leader is a very old view of leadership that can be found in ancient Eastern and Western thought and is often used to describe religious leaders. The servant leader leads because he or she wants to serve others. People follow servant leaders freely because they trust them. Like the transforming leader, the servant leader elevates people. Greenleaf also says that servant leadership must pass this test. Do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, and more likely themselves to become servants? As normative theories of leadership, both servant leadership and transforming leadership are areas of leadership ethics that are open to ethical analysis and provide a foundation of ideas for developing normative theories of leadership. If you want to make a name for yourself in the social science paradigm of leadership studies, you must have a good questionnaire. While Burns' theory was groundbreaking, it was Bass's work on transformational leadership that shaped most of the empirical research we see today on ethics. Bass focuses on measuring transformational leadership. He devoted the multi-factor leadership questionnaire. Bass focuses on how leaders use their idealized intelligence or charisma, intellectual stimulation, individual consideration, and inspirational motivation in order to change the followers so they could perform well. These variables have moral implications, but unlike transforming leadership, they are not explicit. Bass assumes that altruism is needed in order to have ethical success, yet there are many cases where altruistic leaders are misguided and do not have ethical success at all. Authentic leadership measures self-awareness, balanced processing, internalized moral perspective, and relational transparency. Authentic leadership focuses on how leaders' self-knowledge and transparency contributes to making them effective and ethical leaders. Morality seems to be both the result of a leader being authentic and equality of authenticity. David Harrison defines ethical leadership as the demonstration of normatively appropriate conduct through personal actions and interpersonal relationships. There are 10 questions that should always be asked in any type of ethical leadership questionnaire. Listen to what employees have to say. Discuss business ethics or values with employees. A leader should ask what is the right thing to do when making decisions. The leader should make fair and balanced decisions. The leader should be trusted. The leader has the best interest of employees in mind. The leader defines success not just by results, but also the way they are obtained. The leader disciplines employees who violate ethical standards. And the leader sets an example on how to do things the right way in terms of ethics. The leader should also conduct his or personal life in a very ethical manner. Research on leadership has found itself leaning toward the power of traits. Social scientists describe the traits, qualities, and behaviors that constitute good leaders as the Rosetta Stone. Some ethical challenges can consist of temptations of power, the problems of ego, and self-interest, the burdens of being responsible for the welling of groups that consist of the people have a variety of needs and interests. Leadership ethics must encompass the personal and intellectual challenges of leading and following. In order to do this, it has to tap into areas such as history, literature, philosophy, and art for insights into human behavior and values. Perhaps one of the most striking things about history is the fact that people seem to always hope for the same moral behavior from their leaders. Leadership ethics offers a place where the humanities and social science sides of the fields come together and learn from each other. It is almost impossible to talk about leadership without talking about ethics. The leader-follower relationship is a long-standing part of the human condition.